The water spoke to Olivia Kane in a language most men would never understand, whispering its secrets about depth and current, about hidden rocks that could snap a steer's leg or drown a cowboy in seconds. She stood at the edge of the Arkansas River on that scorching June morning in 1878, her boots sinking slightly into the mud, watching the brown water churn past with an intensity that made the 15 drovers behind her shift uncomfortably in their saddles. They had been driving 2,000 head of cattle from Cannon City, Colorado toward the railhead in Dodge City, Kansas for 3 weeks now, and this crossing would be the most dangerous yet. "Miss Kane," said Forrest Harding, removing his hat and wiping the sweat from his brow with a dusty bandana. The trail boss was a man of 30 years with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of creek stone, and he had been watching Olivia assess the river for the better part of an hour. "What are you thinking?" Olivia turned to face him, her dark blonde braid hanging over one shoulder, her own hat shading green eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of every waterway she had ever encountered. At 24, she had spent her entire life along rivers, first helping her father operate a ferry across the Missouri, then guiding wagon trains through treacherous crossings after he died. She knew water the way most people knew their own homes, understood its moods and temperaments with an intimacy that bordered on spiritual. "The current is stronger than it looks," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the river's roar. "See how the surface looks smooth about 20 yards out? That is where the channel drops off. The bottom there is 15 feet down, maybe more, and the current will pull anything into it like a whirlpool. If we try to cross straight, we will lose half the herd." Forrest dismounted and came to stand beside her, studying the water with renewed attention. He had hired Olivia in Cannon City after his previous river guide had gotten drunk and fallen off a cliff, breaking both legs. The other ranchers had laughed at him for bringing a woman on a cattle drive, but Forrest had seen Olivia guide a freight wagon across a swollen creek that would have drowned lesser men, and he knew talent when he saw it. Still, this was different. This was 2,000 head of prime Texas longhorns worth a fortune, and 15 men whose lives depended on making the right call. "Where then?" he asked. Olivia pointed upstream, where the river bent around a stand of cottonwood trees. "There. The water is shallower, and the current splits around those rocks. It will take us an extra 2 hours to drive the herd up there, but we can cross in 3 groups. The first group will break the trail and the others will follow. The cattle will be able to keep their footing." Forrest looked at her for a long moment, and something passed between them in the silence, something that had been building since Cannon City. He nodded slowly. "All right, we do it your way." The murmuring started immediately among the men. Charlie Wright, a bow-legged cowboy from Texas with a reputation for trouble, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "We are taking orders from a woman now, boss. My grandmother could point at a river and say it looks dangerous." "Your grandmother never guided a cattle drive," Forrest said, his voice hard. "Miss Kane has. She knows rivers better than any man alive, and on this drive, when it comes to water crossings, she leads. Anyone got a problem with that can collect their pay and head back to Cannon City on foot." Nobody moved. Charlie glared but said nothing more. They spent the next 3 hours moving the herd upstream, and Olivia rode alongside Forrest at the front, her mare dancing nervously as the cattle lowed and jostled. The heat was oppressive, the kind that made mirages shimmer on the horizon and turned sweat into salt crystals on skin. Olivia could feel the eyes of the drovers on her back, some skeptical, some curious, all waiting to see if she would prove herself or fail spectacularly. "You did not have to defend me back there," she said quietly. Forrest glanced at her, one corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Yes, I did." I am the trail boss, and I made the decision to trust your judgment. If the men do not respect that, they will not respect me, and a cattle drive cannot function without respect and order. Still, thank you." They reached the crossing point, and Olivia dismounted, wading into the water to test the bottom. The cold was a shock after the heat, and the current pulled at her legs, but she had been right. Here the river was only 4 feet deep at its center, and the rocks provided natural stepping points. She marked the path in her mind, memorizing every detail, then returned to shore. "I will ride across first with 5 men," she said to Forrest. "Once we are on the other side, start the first group of cattle. Keep them tight together so they follow the leaders. Do not let them spread out or they will drift into the deeper water." Forrest nodded, then called out the names of 5 drovers. Charlie Wright was not among them, which Olivia suspected was intentional. The chosen men followed her into the river, and she led them across slowly, calling out warnings about submerged rocks and sudden drop-offs. Her mare was sure-footed and calm, responding to the slightest pressure of Olivia's knees, and they made it to the far bank without incident. The first group of cattle came next, 600 head pushed into the water by the drovers on the Cannon City side. The longhorns balked at first, their horns clashing as they bunched up, but then the lead steer plunged in and the others followed. Olivia watched with her heart in her throat as the mass of brown and white bodies surged through the current, water spraying up around them. One steer stumbled, and for a terrible moment she thought it would go down, but it recovered and kept moving. The second and third groups crossed just as successfully, and by late afternoon, the entire herd was on the eastern bank, the men whooping and laughing with relief. Forrest was the last to cross, and when he rode up beside Olivia, his eyes were bright with something that looked like pride. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she corrected. "Your men followed orders. That matters as much as knowing where to cross." They made camp that evening in a meadow of prairie grass, and the mood was celebratory. Cookie, the trail cook, made a stew with the last of the fresh vegetables, and someone produced a harmonica. Olivia sat slightly apart from the men, as was proper, but she felt their acceptance in a way she had not before. Even Charlie Wright nodded to her when he passed, though his expression remained sour. Forrest brought her a plate of food and settled down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You never said how you learned so much about rivers," he said. Olivia ate slowly, savoring the hot food after a long day. "My father ran a ferry on the Missouri River outside St. Joseph. I grew up on the water. He taught me to read currents to understand how water moves and why. When he died 5 years ago, I took over the ferry for a while, but there were men who did not like taking orders from a woman. They complained to the territorial authorities, said it was not proper. Eventually, I sold the ferry and started hiring out as a river guide for wagon trains and freight companies." "That must have been hard," Forrest said quietly, "losing your father and your livelihood." She shrugged, though the pain of those memories still stung. "Life is hard for everyone on the frontier. You adapt or you die. I adapted." "You have other family, a brother in California. We write occasionally, but he has his own life. What about you? How does a man end up running cattle drives through Colorado?" Forrest stretched his legs out in front of him, his boots dusty and worn. "I worked on ranches in Texas from the time I was 12, learned the cattle business from the ground up. After the war, I saved enough money to start my own operation near Austin, but a drought wiped me out 3 years ago. Lost almost everything. So now I hire out as a trail boss, moving other people's cattle. It pays well and I am building up my stake again. Someday I will have my own ranch, but this time I will do it right. Somewhere with good water and grass that does not turn brown half the year. Where are you thinking? Montana, maybe. Or Wyoming. Somewhere north where the grass grows thick and the winters are harsh but the cattle can fatten up properly. They talked until the stars came out, and Olivia found herself enjoying his company in a way she had not enjoyed anyone's in years. Forrest was smart and thoughtful, and he listened when she spoke instead of interrupting or dismissing her thoughts. When she finally excused herself to sleep, he stood as well, his manners those of a gentleman despite his rough occupation. "Good night, Miss Kane," he said. "Olivia," she replied. "You can call me Olivia." "Only if you call me Forrest," she nodded, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the campfire, and went to her bedroll under the supply wagon. The next days fell into a rhythm. They pushed the herd east across the Kansas plains, covering 12 to 15 miles each day depending on the terrain and the availability of water. Olivia rode at the front with Forrest during the day, and they talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories and dreams and observations about the land they crossed. At night they sat together by the fire, and the other drovers grew accustomed to seeing them as a unit, a partnership that extended beyond the professional. 2 weeks after the Arkansas River crossing, they encountered a smaller stream that looked deceptively calm. Olivia insisted on checking it first, and Forrest agreed without question. She waded in, probing with a long stick, and discovered that recent rains had undermined the banks. What looked like solid ground was actually a thin crust over deep mud that would trap anything that stepped on it. "We need to go 5 miles north," she reported. "There is higher ground there and the crossing will be safer." Charlie Wright, who had been growing increasingly resentful of Olivia's authority, finally snapped. 5 miles? That is half a day lost. The crossing looks fine to me. I have been driving cattle for 15 years, and I say we cross here. Forrest's jaw tightened. Olivia says we go north, so we go north. She is just a woman, Charlie said, his voice rising. What does she know that we do not? Forrest was off his horse in one smooth motion, and he stood nose to nose with Charlie, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Say that again." The entire camp went silent. Charlie looked at Forrest, then at the other drovers, and seemed to realize he had pushed too far. "I am just saying we could save time. Time does not matter if we lose cattle or men. Olivia knows rivers and streams better than anyone I have ever met, and I trust her judgment. You will trust it too, or you can leave right now. Your choice." Charlie backed down, but the anger in his eyes promised that this was not over. They went north and crossed without incident, but the confrontation left Olivia shaken. That night, as she sat by herself on the edge of camp, Forrest came and sat beside her. "I am sorry about Charlie," he said. "He is a good cowboy, but he has old-fashioned ideas about women." "I am used to it," Olivia said, though her voice was tight. "Men have been telling me I do not belong all my life." "Well, you belong here." Forrest reached out and took her hand, and the touch sent a jolt through her. "I need you on this drive, not just because you are the best river guide I have ever seen, but because He paused, searching for words. "Because I like having you here, I like talking to you, I like the way you see the world. And I know this is not the time or place, but I cannot stop thinking about what happens when this drive ends." Olivia's heart was pounding. "What do you mean?" "I mean I do not want to say goodbye to you in Dodge City. I mean I want to see where this goes, whatever this is between us." He looked at her, his gray eyes earnest in the firelight. "Tell me I am not imagining it." "You are not imagining it," she whispered. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she did not. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question more than a statement. Then Olivia reached up and pulled him closer, and the kiss deepened, becoming something fierce and certain. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "I have never felt like this before," Forrest admitted. "I have known women, but none of them made me feel the way you do." "How do I make you feel?" "Like I want to be better. Like I want to build something that lasts. Like I have finally found someone who understands what it means to fight for every inch of ground in this world." Olivia rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat together in comfortable silence, the sounds of the cattle and the night birds forming a gentle symphony around them. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened. They were careful to maintain propriety in front of the men, but everyone knew something had shifted. Forrest consulted Olivia on decisions beyond water crossings, valuing her insights on everything from where to camp to how to handle disputes among the drovers. She, in turn, found herself thinking not just about the immediate demands of the drive, but about the future, about what it would mean to partner with a man like Forrest in more than just a professional capacity. They crossed into Kansas in mid-July, and the landscape changed from rolling prairie to flatter grasslands that stretched endlessly in every direction. The heat was brutal, and water became scarcer. Twice Olivia had to guide them miles out of their way to find streams that had not dried up completely. The cattle were losing weight and the men were exhausted, but they pressed on. One evening, about 2 weeks from Dodge City, a summer storm rolled in from the west. Olivia saw the dark clouds building and the particular greenish tint to the sky that meant trouble. "We need to secure the herd," she told Forrest urgently. "This is going to be bad." They worked frantically to bunch the cattle into a tight group and position riders all around them. The storm hit with terrifying speed, wind whipping the grass flat and lightning splitting the sky. Thunder boomed so loud it seemed to shake the earth, and the cattle began to panic. Olivia had never seen a stampede, but she had heard stories, and she knew that if 2,000 longhorns decided to run, nothing could stop them. The cattle surged forward, and suddenly they were all riding hell for leather through the storm, trying to turn the herd, to get the leaders moving in a circle so the stampede would burn itself out. Rain lashed Olivia's face, and lightning revealed nightmarish glimpses of horns and wild eyes. Her mare was terrified but responsive, and Olivia guided her alongside the leaders, shouting and waving her hat even though she knew they could not hear her over the thunder. Forrest appeared beside her, his horse foam flecked and heaving. "Get back," he shouted. "It is too dangerous." "Not without you," she shouted back. They rode together, turning the herd by inches, and gradually, impossibly, the cattle began to slow. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, and in the eerie silence that followed, the herd stood steaming and exhausted but intact. Olivia slid from her saddle, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. Forrest caught her, and they held each other in the muddy grass, both trembling with relief and spent adrenaline. "I thought I lost you," he said into her hair. "When I saw you riding into the heart of the stampede, I thought, I know. I felt the same when I saw you." She pulled back to look at him, her hands framing his face. "I love you, Forrest. I know it is fast and maybe it is crazy, but I love you. It is not crazy." He kissed her, hard and desperate. "I love you too. I have loved you since you stood on that riverbank in Colorado and told me exactly how we were going to cross, so confident and sure. I have loved you every day since." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other while the stars came out and the drovers checked the herd, and the night settled around them. The final approach to Dodge City was anticlimactic after the drama of the stampede. They arrived on a blazing afternoon in early August, the cattle trail weary but in good condition, and Forrest sold them to a buyer from Chicago for a price that made him whistle low. After he paid off the drovers and settled accounts, He found Olivia waiting at the hotel where she had taken a room. "Walk with me," he asked. They strolled through the dusty streets of Dodge City, past saloons and mercantiles and the railroad depot where trains screamed and hissed. Forrest seemed nervous, which was unlike him, and Olivia felt her own anxiety building. "I have been thinking," he said finally, "about what I said before, about wanting a ranch in Montana or Wyoming, about building something that lasts. Yes, I want to do that with you, not as my river guide or my employee, but as my wife, as my partner in everything." He stopped walking and turned to face her, reaching into his pocket. "I know this is sudden. I know we have only known each other a few months, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Olivia Kane, will you marry me?" He held out a ring, simple gold with a small sapphire, and Olivia felt tears spring to her eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they kissed right there on Main Street, scandalizing a passing preacher's wife and earning cheers from a group of drovers outside a saloon. They were married 3 days later by a judge in his office, with Cookie and 2 of the other drovers as witnesses. Olivia wore a new dress she bought with her wages from the drive, pale blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and Forrest wore his best shirt and vest. It was not a fancy wedding, but it was real, and when the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Olivia felt a joy so profound it seemed to fill her entire body. They spent their wedding night in a real bed in a real hotel, a luxury after months of sleeping on the ground, and Forrest was gentle and passionate in equal measure. Afterward, they lay tangled together, talking about the future. "I have been looking at land notices," Forrest said, tracing patterns on her shoulder. "There is good ranch country in Montana Territory near Virginia City. Open range, plenty of water from mountain streams. We could file a claim under the Homestead Act, build a cabin, start small with a couple hundred head. And I could scout water sources, help you pick the best locations for pastures." Olivia felt excitement building. "We could build something really good, Forrest, something that is ours. More than good, something exceptional, together." They left Dodge City a week later, traveling north by rail to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and then by wagon into Montana Territory. The journey took 3 weeks, and with every mile, Olivia felt like she was traveling toward a new life, leaving behind the woman who had to fight for every scrap of respect, and becoming someone who was valued not despite being a woman, but because she brought unique skills and perspectives that made her irreplaceable. They arrived in Virginia City in late September, when the aspens were turning gold and the air had the crisp bite of coming winter. Forrest used most of his savings to file a homestead claim on 320 acres along a creek that Olivia identified as having year-round flow. The land was beautiful, rolling hills covered in grass with stands of pine and a view of distant mountains that took her breath away. "This is perfect," she said, standing in what would become their front yard. "The creek will never dry up, and look how the land slopes. In spring, the snow melt will water the lower pastures naturally." They spent the fall building a cabin with help from neighbors who appeared with axes and saws, men and women who understood that survival on the frontier required cooperation. The cabin was small but solid, one room with a sleeping loft and a stone fireplace that Forrest built with painstaking care. Olivia made curtains from flour sacks and planted a garden that she hoped would take root before winter. By the time the first snow fell in November, they were settled. Forrest had purchased a small herd of 40 cattle from a rancher who was selling out, and Olivia had mapped every water source within 10 miles of their property. They worked from sunrise to sunset and fell into bed each night exhausted but content. Winter in Montana was harsh in a way that Colorado had never been. The snow came in waves, burying the land under white drifts that made travel impossible for days at a time. Olivia and Forrest were snowed in for 3 weeks in December, and they passed the time playing cards, reading the few books they owned aloud to each other, and making love by the fire. It was during this time that Olivia realized she was pregnant. She told Forrest on Christmas morning, and he reacted with a whoop of joy that startled the cattle in the barn. "Are you sure?" he asked, picking her up and spinning her around. "I am sure. The baby will come in summer, I think. July or August." He set her down carefully, suddenly treating her like she was made of glass. "You need to rest. Sit down. Should you be sitting down?" she laughed. "I am pregnant, not sick. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I will be fine." But as winter gave way to spring and spring to summer, Olivia found the pregnancy harder than she expected. The heat made her nauseous, and her belly grew so large she could barely ride. Forrest was constantly worried, hovering over her until she had to shoo him away. In mid-July, 3 days of false labor left her exhausted and frightened, convinced something was wrong. The real labor started on a Tuesday morning while Forrest was checking fence lines. Olivia was alone when the first real contraction hit, and she knew immediately that this was different. She made it to the cabin and sent their hired hand, a teenaged boy named Tommy who helped with the cattle, to fetch the midwife from town. Forrest arrived home to find Olivia in hard labor, and his face went white. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Garrett, arrived an hour later and took charge. The labor lasted all afternoon and into the evening, and there were moments when Olivia thought she could not possibly endure another contraction, another wave of pain. But Forrest held her hand and whispered encouragement, and Mrs. Garrett was competent and calm, and finally, as the sun was setting, their son was born. "A boy," Mrs. Garrett announced, holding up the squalling infant. "A big, healthy boy." Forrest wept openly as he held his son for the first time, and Olivia felt a love so fierce and protective it was almost frightening. They named him James, after her father, and he had Forrest's gray eyes and a surprisingly full head of dark hair. The years that followed were hard but good. The ranch grew slowly but steadily, and Forrest's reputation as an honest rancher with high-quality cattle spread through the territory. Olivia continued to work alongside him. Sometimes with James tied to her back in a cradle board she fashioned herself. She taught Forrest things about water management that he had never considered, helping him create irrigation systems that kept their pastures green even in dry years. Her knowledge gave them an edge over other ranchers, and neighboring spreads started asking for her advice. When James was 2, Olivia became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier. Their second son, Daniel, was born in April of 1882, and he was a quieter baby than James, with Olivia's green eyes and a thoughtful demeanor. 2 years later came their daughter, Sarah, who was loud and demanding and wrapped Forrest around her tiny finger from the moment she was born. By 1885, their ranch had grown to over 1,000 acres and supported 200 head of cattle. They had built a larger house, hired 3 full-time hands, and established themselves as one of the more successful operations in the region. Olivia still consulted on water crossings for cattle drives passing through the area, and she had become something of a legend. Stories were told about the woman who knew rivers better than any man alive, and drovers would detour to ask her advice. One summer evening, when James was 7 and already begging to go on his first cattle drive, Olivia sat on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the mountains pink and gold. Forrest came and sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "You ever regret it?" he asked. Giving up guiding to be a rancher's wife. Olivia looked at him in surprise. I did not give up guiding. I still guide cattle across rivers, just our cattle instead of someone else's. And I am not just a rancher's wife. I am a rancher. This is my land as much as yours. I know. I just worry sometimes that you gave up too much freedom. She squeezed his hand. I gave up the freedom to be alone and struggling. What I gained was so much better. A partner who respects me, children I adore, land that is mine, work that matters. I would not trade this life for anything. Not even for the excitement of those early days. The cattle drives and river crossings, Olivia smiled. Those days were exciting, but they were also lonely and dangerous and uncertain. This is better, this is real. They sat in comfortable silence, and Olivia thought about that first meeting at the Arkansas River, about the cattleman who had been willing to let her lead because he recognized her skill. So much had changed since then, but the fundamental respect and love between them had only grown stronger. In the fall of 1886, Charlie Wright showed up at their ranch, looking old and weathered beyond his years. He had been injured in a stampede and could no longer ride, and he had heard that the Hardings sometimes hired hands for less demanding work. Forrest was inclined to turn him away, remembering the disrespect Charlie had shown Olivia years ago, but Olivia surprised him by advocating for giving Charlie a chance. People can change, she said, and everyone deserves a second chance. Charlie proved her right. He worked hard at the tasks they gave him, never complained, and one evening he sought out Olivia to apologize. I was wrong about you, he said, hat in his hands. Back on that drive, I thought you were just a woman trying to do a man's job, but you were not doing a man's job. You were doing your job, and you were better at it than any of us. I am sorry for making things difficult. I appreciate you saying that, Olivia replied. We all have things we need to learn. By 1890, James was 12 and a natural with cattle, riding and roping with a skill that made Forrest proud. Daniel, at 8, was more interested in the business side of ranching, always asking about prices and markets and how to calculate profit margins. Sarah, at 6, announced she wanted to learn everything her mother knew about water, and Olivia began teaching her daughter to read rivers and streams the way her own father had taught her. The ranch continued to prosper, surviving droughts and harsh winters and the occasional cattle disease that wiped out less prepared operations. Olivia's water management strategies became well known throughout Montana, and she was occasionally invited to speak at cattlemen's associations, one of the few women ever accorded such respect. She always brought Forrest with her, and they presented as a team, showing how combining traditional ranching knowledge with specialized expertise in water could create a more resilient and profitable operation. In 1895, when James turned 17, he asked to join a cattle drive heading to Wyoming. Forrest was reluctant, remembering the dangers, but Olivia said their son needed to test himself. Let him go, she advised. He needs to learn that he can handle hard things. That is what we both did, and look how we turned out. James returned 6 weeks later, taller and more confident, full of stories about river crossings and stampedes and sleeping under the stars. I met this girl in Laramie, he admitted shyly. Her name is Catherine. She works at her father's mercantile. I told her I would write. Olivia and Forrest exchanged amused glances. Did you now? Forrest said. She is smart and funny, and she wants to be a teacher. I think you would like her. They met Catherine the following spring when James brought her to the ranch, and she was indeed smart and funny, with a practical streak that reminded Olivia of herself. James married Catherine in 1897, and they built a house on the eastern section of the ranch, starting their own herd. Daniel went to school in Virginia City and eventually became a lawyer, handling legal matters for ranchers throughout the territory. Sarah, true to her early interest, became an expert in water rights and hydrology, consulting for ranchers and mining operations across Montana and Wyoming. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and work and family gatherings. Grandchildren arrived, 9 in total, and the ranch that Olivia and Forrest had started with 40 cattle, and a dream grew into a multi-generational operation that employed dozens of people and supported hundreds of families indirectly. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1911, Forrest took Olivia back to the spot where they had first met, or as close as they could get. They traveled by train to Colorado, then hired horses and rode to the Arkansas River. The river looked different than Olivia remembered, or perhaps she was the one who had changed, but the sound of the water brought back a flood of memories. "I knew that day," Forrest said, standing beside her on the bank. "When I watched you read that river like it was a book only you could understand, I knew you were someone extraordinary. You took a big risk, letting a woman guide your cattle drive. Best risk I ever took, best decision I ever made." He put his arm around her waist. 30 years, and I love you more now than I did then. That is because you know me better now. You know all my faults and stubborn habits. I know that you are the strongest person I have ever met, that you built a life through sheer determination and skill, that you raised 3 incredible children who are out there making the world better, that you turned a piece of raw Montana land into something lasting and beautiful. And yes, I know you are stubborn, but so am I, which is why we work. They stood by the river until the sun began to set, then rode back to town, where their children and grandchildren were waiting to celebrate with them. The party lasted late into the night, full of laughter and stories and the comfortable chaos of a large, happy family. Olivia lived to see Montana become a state, to see automobiles replace horses on many roads, to see the wild frontier of her youth transform into something more settled and civilized. She taught her granddaughters to read rivers, passing on the knowledge her father had given her. She and Forrest grew old together, their hands gnarled from decades of work, but still finding each other every evening as they sat on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Forrest died peacefully in his sleep in 1925, at the age of 77. Olivia held his hand as he took his last breath, and though her heart broke, she knew they had been granted something rare and precious. A true partnership, a great love, and a life fully lived. She continued running the ranch with James for another 5 years, still sharp and capable despite her age. She died in 1930, at 76, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, leaving behind a legacy that extended far beyond the land and cattle. She had proven that skill and knowledge mattered more than gender, that a woman could lead and excel in a world that tried to tell her she could not. She had loved deeply and been loved in return. She had built something lasting. At her funeral, James told the story of his parents' first meeting, about how his mother had known rivers better than any man alive, and how his father had been wise enough to let her lead. It became a family legend, repeated to each new generation, a reminder that the best partnerships are built on mutual respect, that love grows strongest when it is rooted in equality, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when someone is brave enough to trust in something beyond tradition. The ranch continued to thrive, passed down through the generations, and on the gate leading to the property, someone eventually hung a sign that read Harding Ranch, ESD, 1878. Below it, in smaller letters, was carved, "She knew rivers better than any man alive." It became a point of pride, a piece of history, And every child raised on that land learned the story of Olivia Kane Harding, the woman who had helped their great or great-great-grandfather drive 2,000 cattle across the frontier, and who had stayed to build an empire. Years after Olivia's death, when Sarah was an old woman herself, she took her own granddaughter down to the creek that ran through the property. "Listen," she said as they stood on the bank. "Really listen. The water is always talking, always telling you what you need to know. Your great-great-grandmother taught me that, and her father taught her, and now I am teaching you. This is our inheritance, not just the land but the knowledge, the understanding that water is life, and if you respect it and learn its language, it will take care of you." The girl, who was 8 and earnest, nodded solemnly. "I will listen, grandmother, I promise." And she did. The tradition continued, passed mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, a living connection to Olivia Kane Harding and the wisdom she had carried from the Missouri River to the Arkansas River to the mountain streams of Montana. It was a legacy of knowledge and strength, of love and partnership, of a woman who had refused to be limited by her time, and a man who had loved her for exactly who she was. The ranch stood for over 100 years, a testament to what two people could build when they combined their strengths and trusted each other completely. And though the world changed dramatically over those decades, becoming more modern and complex and strange, the fundamental truths that Olivia and Forrest had lived by remained constant. Work hard, treat people fairly, respect the land and water, choose love over pride, build something that lasts. On warm summer evenings, when the light turns golden and the mountains cast long shadows, some people claimed they could still see two figures on horseback riding along the creek, checking water levels and discussing where to move the herd next season. Whether it was really their ghosts or just the play of light and shadow and wishful memory, no one could say for certain. But the story persisted, as good stories do, becoming part of the mythology of the place. The town of Virginia City grew and changed, but old-timers still told stories about Olivia Harding, the woman who had known rivers better than any man alive. Those stories inspired other women, giving them courage to pursue their own paths in male-dominated fields, to trust their own expertise, to demand the respect they deserved. Olivia never knew she would become a symbol, a legend, but perhaps that is always how legends are born, from people who simply live their truth, who do their work with excellence, and who love fiercely and well. In the end, what mattered most was not the legend but the life. Two people meeting by chance on a riverbank in Colorado, recognizing something essential in each other, brave enough to take a risk on love in the middle of a cattle drive. Everything else flowed from that moment of connection, that choice to trust and respect and build together. It was a simple story, really, but then the best stories usually are. Boy meets girl, girl knows rivers, boy is smart enough to let her lead. Together they build a life, they fall in love. They stay in love, they create something beautiful. The end. Except it was not really the end, because their children carried them forward, and their children's children, and so on down through time. Love like theirs does not end when the people die. It echoes forward, shaping the future in ways both seen and unseen, a current as persistent and powerful as the rivers Olivia knew so well. On the original homestead, where Forrest and Olivia had built their first cabin, their great-great-grandson eventually built a new house, modern and comfortable, but he kept the original stone fireplace that Forrest had constructed with his own hands. On the mantel he placed a photograph, faded and cracked with age, showing a young couple on their wedding day in Dodge City. The woman wore a pale blue dress and looked directly at the camera with intelligent, confident eyes. The man stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder, looking at her instead of the camera, his expression one of unmistakable love and pride. Below the photograph was a brass plaque with an inscription. Olivia Kane Harding and Forrest Harding, married August 1878. She knew Rivers better than any man alive. He was wise enough to let her lead. Together they built everything you see around you. Remember them. Honor them. Continue what they started. And that is exactly what their descendants did, generation after generation, keeping the knowledge alive, maintaining the land, respecting the water, and telling the story of how it all began with a woman, a river, and a cattleman who understood that true strength lies not in dominating others, but in recognizing excellence wherever you find it and having the wisdom to follow it, even when it challenges everything you thought you knew about how the world should work. The cattle still grazed those Montana hills, descendants of the 40-head Forrest had purchased in 1878. The creek still flowed clear and cold from the mountains, following the path Olivia had traced all those years ago. The land endured, shaped by their hands and vision, a living monument to what love and partnership and mutual respect can create. And somewhere, perhaps, in whatever place spirits go when their work on earth is done, Olivia and Forrest sat together by a river, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching the water flow by and knowing they had done well, they had loved well, they had built something that would outlast them both. It was enough. It was everything.